So I'm very pleased to introduce Lisa Williams for our PM session on liberating the classroom. Lisa Williams is the founder of the Edinburgh Caribbean Association and creator of the Black History Walks of Edinburgh. Lisa Williams grew up in Dorset in a British Grenadian family. Turn that down a little. And moved to Grenada to run cultural and educational exchanges for 20 years. After relocating to Edinburgh in 2011, she founded the Edinburgh Caribbean Association and curates a range of arts events across Scotland to promote Caribbean culture. She runs educational and anti-racist programs in schools and universities and leads walking tours focusing on Edinburgh's Black history. Lisa works as a heritage consultant to many national and regional institutions across Scotland and is a member of several advisory boards. She has a BA in psychology and African and Asian studies, an MA in arts, festival and cultural management, is a research associate at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh and an honorary fellow in the School of History, Classics and Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh. For her MA final project, she analysed the curation of Scotland's imperial history in heritage institutions through the lens of critical race theory. So delighted to have you, Lisa, and we'll allow you to take it away.
Yeah, thanks for playing the song. The song actually is by a calypsonian called Black Wizard, who is based in Grenada, is from Grenada, and actually used to be my daughter's primary school teacher. So that's just to give you an indication of the kind of education that she had when she was at that school for a little while, quite a radical education in some ways. So I wanted to start with that. Thank you. So I'm going to give you a quick, very brief introduction to the Black History Walking Tours of Edinburgh, which I've been running for about almost 4 years now. And I came to it because I realised that people were not bringing this history to the fore in Edinburgh, and it's something that's been done in other places, and I thought there's a very, very big gap here, so I thought it was something that was important to do. So let's go to the next slide. So I thought I'd start from my own undergraduate experience, because I realised it's quite different from a lot of experiences that I've been hearing about recently. So I was in a centre called AFRAS in the University of Sussex, way back in 1989 to 1992. And it was a really interesting experience because we got the opportunity to really get into interdisciplinary learning. There was quite a really good opportunity to speak to faculty as well. So there was much less of a official separation between faculty and students. So one of the things we were able to do is, let's say if we saw a gap on the reading list, we were able to come and do a presentation about people that we thought ought to be on that reading list and they could be added, that kind of thing. It was very much about challenging mainstream theories, particularly around politics and sociology. We had professors and also scholarship from the Global South, which was a wonderful experience because we had all sorts of people who were well-known post-colonial scholars, and speaking to a lot of young people in Britain now, especially coming to Scotland 10 years ago and speaking to younger people and realising that people never had a black teacher in primary school, secondary school, black or brown teacher, or a professor in university as well. So for me, it was a little bit shocking, having been out for 20 years and come back and realising that this is the situation in general. And there were regular demonstrations and protests happening on campus. It was the time, but it was particularly something about Sussex that allowed that to happen. So let's go to the next slide, please. So I'm just going to read this out. The school set out to challenge existing concepts of race, ethnicity, identity, culture and economy in the post-colonial world by bringing together subject areas as diverse as history, literature, politics, anthropology, geography, psychology, economics and cultural studies. It recruited widely and brought in academics from both colonial universities and those that recently obtained independence. And the aim was to ensure that those teaching and writing in the school also had experience of the places that they lectured and wrote on. And this is actually taken from the History of AFRAS booklet, which you can find online if you want to read it. So let's go to the next one. And one of the books that stood out to me at the time was The Groundings of My Brothers by Guyanese academic Walter Rodney. I actually was lucky enough to get a personal copy of this book from a friend of his a few years after, several years after he was sadly assassinated in 1980. And some of the important things out of that book that really resonated with me at the time, and I always still think about, is the fact that he was connecting history very much to the present, which is something that I do on my tours, really attacking racist distortions of imperialism in the academy itself, focusing on this, having a sincere dialogue in an authentic exchange, and then meeting people where they're at. So making sure that the language that you use is accessible to people. And also he very much was about living amongst the people he was writing about as well. So such a contrast to, as we know, so many of the academics, that are, probably teaching you at the moment. And also making the history about the African diaspora really central to Western development as well, which again is something that I try to do on my tours as we go through. So let's go to the next one, please. And then living in the Caribbean, of course, those of you familiar with the Caribbean, we've got Caribbean family, we've spent time there, will know that the veranda is a very specific kind of place where it's that interface between the indoors and the outdoors. There are always people showing up on the veranda from all sorts of places. There might be friends, might be neighbours, might be people you've never met. And so the fact that the veranda is a place where people can show up at any hour, could be early in the morning, could be late at night, and those kinds of conversations that would be ongoing and developing on the veranda, I think was very much part of my kind of informal education as well. And especially having a lot of discourse with Rastafarians who, of course, very, very inventive in language, constantly chanting down Babylon, but also, of course, upholding patriarchy in certain ways as well. So let's go to the next slide, please. So before we just go on to the tours, I just want to mention too, so within my history, so my mother grew up in Grenada. She grew up in a household with Haile Selassie on the wall, and this was in the early 1940s, because my grandfather, who was from Barbados, somebody who was very well connected with other people, all followers of Marcus Garvey, and a lot of them went on to become the leaders, the first independence leaders of the different areas of the Caribbean afterwards. And I think that although there's serious issues, of course, with Haile Selassie's own history and the massacres of Eritrean people, when I meet Eritrean people, a lot of them are very horrified that so many people in the Caribbean deify Haile Selassie in this way. But of course, Rastafari is extremely diverse. So again, the kinds of conversations that we'll be having in those community settings, people will be coming with all sorts of different ideas and challenging each other, of course, on the deification of Haile Selassie himself as well. So my daughter's own education, partly homeschool, learning about Pan-Africanism from the age of 7, which she didn't really want to learn about at 7, but she did. Having gone to a school where you've got very committed anti-colonial teachers as well, teaching primary school, so from 4 upwards, and having trying to really deal with the vestiges of colonialism and colonial thought in a place like Grenada as well. So a place like Grenada, having gone through a popular revolution in the end of the 1970s, so from 1979 to 1983, and at that period there was a real emphasis on popular education, and there was this phrase, each one teach one, and there was a huge literacy program, and you find that there were even people in the 80s and 90s that were becoming literate for the first time. So again, I think a lot of the way that I approach the tours is coming out of the experiences and having these conversations with people who are part of that kind of revolutionary movement as well. So the Black History Walking Tours, the space itself, of course, is highly significant. We're moving around the city. Sometimes I move into slightly different places, but we tend to follow a circular route. And we're moving, from those of you that know Edinburgh, moving from the new town into the old town. And we'll show a photograph of the new town in a moment for those of you not familiar with it. The fact that it's embodied learning the fact that we're using all of our senses when we're walking around, and as you'll see later on, bringing in poetry, bringing in sometimes music, bringing in different things to engage people's senses and also engage people's emotions in a different way that may not be necessarily done within a classroom space as well. So it gives us a chance for dialogue as we're moving. It acknowledges people's lived experience as well. And in the very beginning, when I start the tours, I prepare people for the fact that it will be an emotional journey. And it will affect people in slightly different ways. It will affect people in radically different ways. It will evoke all sorts of different emotions as we go along. So to be prepared for these things as we go through. And when we're moving from one location to another, it allows that emotional processing to happen from one place to another. So the way that I craft it in a way is to make sure that if we're talking about topics that are very, very heavy, very painful in lots of ways, then we make sure to lighten up the experience and we focus on something that is positive, that it's uplifting, that people are drawing on strength from the past as well. So I craft it in this way to make sure that the emotional experience is a holistic one and an uplifting one overall. The other thing that I do as well is anticipate that kind of whataboutery thing that often happens. It's kind of like you'll get comments like, yes, but the Scots were slaves as well, or all sorts of things that can sometimes try to derail the conversation. So kind of anticipate what those are going to be, and I kind of spend a couple of minutes on those particular things so that I'm framing the discussion somewhat as we go through. And then you'll see at the end that I always end with a call to action, where we're not just leaving people, we're allowing a sense of networking, a sense of allowing opportunities to get back in contact with me or with other people, and then also to encourage people to do their own research and keep going in that way. So let's go to the next slide, please. So we start here. And those of you who don't know Edinburgh, this is the new town. Edinburgh's new town that was built in the last few decades of the 18th century, referred to as Athens of the North, because Edinburgh was trying to very much compete with London at that time. And also to reinforce this idea of a separation really from ideas that had come from Africa. So that whole idea of referring back to Greece, referring back to Rome, referring to the so-called beginnings of civilization, and that being reified in the buildings and Enlightenment thought and so on. Now, this was actually the most expensive piece of real estate in the world on completion. And if we're thinking about Scotland being one of the poorest nations, particularly in Europe itself at that point, you've got this sudden development, and then you start looking at where the money flows are coming from. You'll find that there were a couple of hundred addresses that showed up on the Slavery Compensation Act just within this area of Edinburgh itself. And it became the biggest urban piece of urban planning in Europe at that point as well. So this is where we begin the tour, and we walk through the street. If you can see the main street that's going through the middle, that gets to that grassy square at the end. So just towards the bottom of the picture, you'll see that grassy square, which is Charlotte, and that was the last piece that was really built in the new town at that time. And then we start heading off from there and going back up into the old town. So let's go to the next slide, please. And then the next thing I do when we're talking at the beginning, we're just getting acquainted with one another. A lot of people don't really know the Caribbean, they're not familiar with it, they can't really name you many places. They might be able to name you Jamaica and Barbados, that might be it. So that's just to give people an idea, to sort of orient their head to thinking about the Caribbean, how all these different places connect to Edinburgh, connect to Scotland. And this is something that, once it's not COVID, then I can pass a map around and people can pass it from one to the other and kind of familiarize themselves with what is where. So let's go to the next slide, please. Now, not all of it, of course, is referring to the Caribbean. So we're going to talk about Black history, and of course, not all of it is about slavery as well. I'm going to concentrate on some of the strategies that I use for helping to bring in those invisibilized stories within the built environment they're seeing, because it very much connects with the Caribbean. But we're also talking about African American experiences, we're talking about stories that relate to the continent, so on, especially as we get towards the Pan-African movement towards the end of the tour as well. So this is where we tend to gather, right underneath the Melbourne Monument, which has been the site of a lot of attention in the last few years, especially from last year. A lot of the Black Lives Matter movement protests was one that was held right here in the square as well, and it's been receiving a lot of media attention for those of you who haven't been following it. So Henry Dundas, Lord Melville, was referred to as uncrowned King of Scotland. I haven't got time to go into all the different cabinet positions that he held, but basically he was a Home Secretary at one point, he was a Secretary of War in the colonies, and he had an awful lot of sway and an awful lot of influence on Scottish MPs as well. So a lot of the controversy has been around whether he was supposed to be this moral abolitionist, which not very many people are on board apart from his own family, and about the fact that he was pushing this idea of gradual abolition. But for me, what I tend to focus on when we're here and we're talking about his role is about him orchestrating the biggest military mission to have ever left Britain, to go and crush resistance in the Caribbean, the smaller islands like Grenada, but also to secure Jamaica, and also to actually go and reinstate chattel slavery in Haiti after the Haitian Revolution. And that's something that we definitely don't talk enough about. So let's go to the next slide, please. So when I talk about the Haitian Revolution, which of course started off went right through the 1790s, and then created the first free Black republic in the Western Hemisphere. Majority of people that come on the tour don't know anything about the Haitian Revolution. We've never heard of it. They know about the American one, know about the French one, and they don't know about the really full revolution, the Haitian Revolution. And the fact that it grew out of previous resistance. I've got a picture here, of course, of Cecile Fatiman, who was one of the voodoo priestess who was part of the ceremony at Bois-Quéman when it first started. And actually, I tried to get people to think about voodoo in a really different way, think about African spirituality in a different way, because quite a lot of people come on the tour don't really even think about the fact that, one, they're indigenous people in the region to begin with, and the fact that African people were being trafficked and holding on to their own spirituality against all oppression and all costs. The fact that the Haitians were able to fight off the British, the Spanish, and the French armies over a period of years is astonishing, and people are really quite shocked when they hear about that, because again, they don't really know about it. So next slide, please. And also we talk about the indigenous resistance. So here we have Joseph Chatoyer of St. Vincent, who was an indigenous leader who fought massive resistance in the 1790s against a lot of Scots, a lot of Scottish military men who eventually put down that resistance, and partly by genocide, but also by exile as well. And again, people are quite shocked when they hear about that too. So let's go to the next slide, please. Here's another statue that is not exactly on eye level, because of course none of these statues are. They're always you have to look up to them. And this one is the Earl of Hopetoun, which is outside Dundas House, which is now the Royal Bank of Scotland, in St Andrew's Square itself. And again, I use these statues as much as I can to bring in the other side of the story, and to bring in the heroes who have fought on the other side and have that direct connection with a lot of these military men. So let's go to the next slide, please. So this is a mock-up. It's an imaginary portrait of a mixed-race man called Julien Fedon, who's one of the leaders of the Fedon Rebellion, which happened in Grenada in, again, the mid-1790s. So what I try to do is bring in as much imagery as I can. And of course, we can't always have portraits of people. Some of them we have, people like Toussaint Louverture, for example, from Haiti. And I tried to bring in images also of statues of people who are commemorated on the other end. So we get a bit of a chance to explore what makes a hero. We start to deconstruct these ideas that people feel they need to hang on to, about ideas of pride or the flip side of that, a sense of shame in their own nation and what people have done. So we get a chance to kind of talk a little bit about that as we go through the tour as well. And also deconstructing this whole hero worship in itself as well, because of course the Fedon rebellion itself had many people who were behind it, not just the leaders at the top. It was actually quite a multiracial revolution, which is really interesting. So also white people, so-called free-coloured or mixed-race people like Julian Fedon was, and African people who were enslaved and joined this movement, which would have been another smaller version of Haiti, actually, if the Scots hadn't come in and crushed that resistance at the last minute, including the Alafutan who we just seen. So let's go to the next slide, please. So the other thing I do is get people to think about the statues, the kinds of people who are commemorated in the Caribbean. Now, of course, the Caribbean is still in a neo-colonial state, but it's still coming out of that period of colonisation, mentally, economically, and otherwise. But so not everybody is commemorated. This is Kwame Gladstone, who is commemorated in Guyana, and his statue is just outside one of the banks, actually in Georgetown. And I talk about him because we talk about John Gladstone, who came from Leith, which is part of Edinburgh, and who received the biggest payout during the Slave Compensation Act, to the tune of £83 million in our money today. But I always bring it back to the people on the other side who were affected by his actions. And we talk about people like Kwame Gladstone, who led a war of resistance in Guyana in one of those plantations that Gladstone actually owned. So get people to think about, it's just a different way of getting people here to think about why we are commemorating these people, why the statues were put up in the first place, whether there was any controversy at the time, which of course there was. A lot of these statues, a lot of the people in Edinburgh at the time were very much against these statues going up, particularly that first one that we saw. So let's go to the next slide, please. So this is another one, David Hume, who there's been a lot of conversation around him at the moment, the last 2 years. So partly because the students in the university, but also the professors in the university starting to get drawn into that conversation now, which is good. Okay, I need to go back. Yeah, thank you. So this was part of the protest last year, a very sort of polite Edinburgh sign put on cardboard on David Hume. And this was part of his infamous racist footnote that he wrote. He published it in on National Characters, an essay that he wrote in 1753, and then he revised it again around 1770, because even at the time it was controversial amongst his own contemporaries as part of the Enlightenment period, who were criticising this racist footnote, which he went after several revisions of keeping it. So several incarnations of that footnote, which was the same, he then eventually, after so much criticism that was getting from his contemporaries, went and shifted that footnote. But he did keep in this line about, I'm sorry for the language, but I'm apt to suspect the Negroes to be naturally inferior to the whites. And originally it was talking about lots of different groups of people across the world, and he sort of brought it down to this one group. So when I interrogate the Enlightenment, and I've done this, sometimes I'll go into this in more detail depending on who's on the group or who's particularly interested, how much time that we have. What I try to do is get people to think about the Enlightenment as racist, as part of the entire colonial project. We talk about stadial theory, and the other philosophers are part of the Enlightenment movement. What I try to do is bring in as much Black intellectual critique as I can. So other Black Enlightenment scholars, who I will refer to in a moment, and also later on people who come into the university and people who are coming from outside, let's say African American scholars who are making that intellectual critique of Hume not that long after he was active in the 18th century. I also use this opportunity to talk about universities in Africa that were predating those in Scotland, because there's an awful lot of pride around, let's say, St Andrews and other universities that have been around for 100 years or so, but actually getting people to think about universities in Africa, let's say in Mali and Timbuktu, that predated those in Scotland. So let's go to the next slide, please. So this is Francis Williams, who is also, if you read the entire footnote, you'll see that he refers to somebody, makes a sort of oblique reference to somebody speaking plainly like a parrot, and he's actually referring to a Jamaican man called Francis Williams, who was actually a man who was a poet. He used to write poetry in Latin. He was educated in England, and then he went back to Jamaica after a certain amount of discrimination that he's getting here, and goes back to open up a school in Jamaica afterwards. So let's go to the next slide, please. This is a man called Anton Wilhelm Amo, which some of you might be familiar with his work. There was a street named after him by after a lot of pressure from Black German groups in Berlin. Last year they named a street after him. He wrote several theses. One of the theses that he wrote, the first one that he wrote on slavery and freedom, was kind of mysteriously disappeared. Maybe one day people will find that. What's interesting about him as well, after teaching, being the first person of African descent to actually teach in European universities, he goes back to Ghana for the last part of his life. And then he starts to immerse himself in the original epistemologies, and he uses that as his base of learning and connecting with the village again. So let's go to the next slide, please. The other thing that I do is try to, if we have access to people's actual words, that I try to take excerpts from speeches that people made when they actually came to Edinburgh in the location that they originally made those speeches. So we have Sarah Parker Remond on the left, who was an African-American speaker, abolitionist, educator, who also revolutionary. She became a doctor, and she came up to Edinburgh in 1860 and 1861 and made several speeches decrying racism and slavery and colonialism, and actually made some really searing intellectual critiques of people like Thomas Carlyle, Scotsman Thomas Carlyle as well. We've got Frederick Douglass on the right, of course the most photographed person in America in the 19th century, got many photographs of him that we can use for imagery. And the fact that he spent almost 2 years in Edinburgh in 1846, 1847, comes back again in 1860 on a whole group of African-American abolitionists that were here, really challenging, not just bringing attention to enslavement in America, but also challenging racist thought that was really starting to grow with the growth of colonialism in the mid-19th century here in Scotland as well. So let's go to the next slide, please. The other thing that I do is bring in poetry as much as I can, so that it's not always a dry intellectual delivery. It's about using poetry to touch the emotions, to touch the heart, to bring in metaphor. It's also the effect of the rhythm of the poetry. So we have John Agar to the left here. Some of you might be familiar with his work, a Guyanese poet, been in Britain for a long time, who wrote a poem about John Edmonstone. There's also a Guyanese man here who assisted Charles Darwin with his own scholarship and his own research. So here he is at the back of the museum in Scotland. We've got Lorna Goodison, who was Poet Laureate of Jamaica up until recently, until last year. And again, I used some of her work in response to Robert Burns, imagining what it would be like if Robert Burns did go to Jamaica, for example. So the next slide, please. I think we need done. So I've got 2 more slides. Other things important to do also is to highlight past examples of very real solidarity. And you've got the ladies, Edinburgh Ladies Emancipation Society to the left. We've got Harriet Tubman to the right. And there was a very strong development of real solidarity between these women, where the Edinburgh Ladies Emancipation Society were getting women all over Scotland to sew and knit clothing to be sent out for the women who were part of Harriet Tubman's Underground Railroad. They were sending money, they were sending all sorts of things that Harriet Tubman was asking for in terms of assistance. The other thing they did as well was really support, over the decades, abolition before their own suffrage, which is totally different than what happened in the US. A lot of Americans come, they're really amazed by that. You can't find them being racist, you can't find them being patronising, you can't find talk about civilising. They talk about the one human family, and it's very, very different from many of these abolitionists that are lauded, as we know, white abolitionists that are lauded in Britain. So we've got one more slide, I think. Two more slides. The other thing I tried to highlight, of course, is Caribbean scholarship, whether that's old classic like Eric Williams' 1944 thesis on capitalism and slavery, or that's ongoing research. We've got Vereen Shepherd here, who's at the University of the West Indies, and she very much focuses on women's resistance in this period as well, throughout the entire Caribbean. So let's go to the next slide, please. Now, at the end of the tour, and this might be a good lead into the Uncover Ed presentation, which is coming after me. So this is actually one of the photos that was part of the Uncover Ed exhibition, which I also use in my tour as well. Because normally when we finish the tour, it's right at the end of the, just by the University of Edinburgh. I talk about the Pan-African movement. I talk about the fact that Edinburgh was one of the hubs of the British Empire, but also a place where Pan-Africanists were able to gather from all over the world and come together and start to really go through that process of decolonising their own nations as well. On the right-hand side, we've got a group here, just to give you an idea of what it's like when we all get together at the end. And the things that I try to make sure to sort of close the tour, again, in a holistic and thoughtful way as much as I can, is to acknowledge, again, people's emotions that have come up, to show and encourage unity, to really get people to reflect on their own experience and how they might have grown from that experience, but also a call to action as well. So we're not just left there, but we're using that knowledge in order to move forward, to progress. So that's me, I'm finished. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the next two presentations.
So Uncover Ed is an archival project nominally located at the University of Edinburgh and guided by the biographies of alumni of colour. The project aims to situate the global image of the institution within its imperial matrix. And this talk will be discussing the experience of the Uncover Ed project and some of its visions moving forward. In light of the work already done or in progress, Uncover Ed reflects on its contributions and implications in the wider decolonising movements in British academia. Specifically, we will reflect on the dissonance between the globalised brand of the University of Edinburgh and its imperial histories, a mismatch that produces salient contradictions in need of critique. So thank you so much. And our very own Hannah is also part of Uncover Ed, so we've got a special affinity here, but we're looking forward to hearing from you, Leah. Thank you so much. Take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction. So our paper was co-written with, well, first of all, it is not an academic paper. It is a work in progress, and it is just our reflections. Between me, Nuzat, and Tana from Uncover Ed. So I'm going to be, I have no visual component to this. So I hope that it can be as engaging as possible. So this talk will be discussing the experience of the Uncover Ed project and some of its visions moving forward. In light of the work already done or in progress, Uncover Ed reflects on its contributions and implications in the wider decolonizing movements in British academia. Specifically, we will reflect on the dissonance between the globalized brand of the University of Edinburgh and its imperial histories, a mismatch that produces salient contradictions in need of critique. We contemplate the impossibility of decolonization within higher education, as universities are institutions of the colonial project. We acknowledge that this necessarily implicates Uncover Ed and its work as not decolonial. Lastly, we propose that in the UK, there is a need to reimagine extra-institutional spaces for communal teaching and learning that do not reproduce the colonial logics of the university empire. So Uncover Ed was originally thought up as a working group by the University of Edinburgh's Global Department to unearth the names and stories of alumni of color from the 19th century onwards, under a decolonial and collaborative label. The university was interested in using the decolonial label for its marketing purposes. The work would culminate with an exhibition of the biographies of some of Edinburgh's alumni of color. However, as we interacted with the archive via the student newspapers and the University of Edinburgh journals from the 19th and 20th centuries, it was impossible to comply with Edinburgh's global needs and Edinburgh Global Department's needs, and it became necessary for us to focus on the imperial contexts of the archive. Before 1945, we found numerous evidence within the archive of the university's vision of itself as an imperial apparatus. So the university spoke of itself as an imperial center. In his address at the 1927 graduation ceremonial, the Vice Chancellor says, very tellingly, "The extent of the empire and the bewildering variety of its climates and soils, and of the animal and the vegetable types which it sheltered, put it in a unique position as regards facilities for research. Edinburgh had always been something of an imperial university," the quote continues. "In the old days, she had attracted large numbers of medical and scientific students from Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. If there were fewer such names in the matriculation album now, it was because the great self-governing dominions were creating training schools of their own, each with its own band of research workers. From the colonies, on the other hand, more particularly the tropical colonies, there would always be a demand for skilled workers. At that moment, steps were being taken to create a unified scientific research service for the colonies." End quote. This quote makes visible the crucial motivations and practical considerations that are at the heart of empire. Distant lands with their exoticized climates and flora and fauna are made exploitable by the colonial project of the university. The natural is transformed into capital, both in terms of material and intellectual wealth. We see the ways in which the university's project is linked to land, labor, and knowledge production. The excerpt by the Vice Chancellor speaks to the university's efforts to establish centers of knowledge collection and production to replace indigenous knowledge systems in the colonies. This historical process of dispossession or the killing of knowledge systems has been called epistemicide by the sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos. Just as colonial political practices carved up the globe in the 18th and 19th centuries, de Sousa Santos says, knowledge, the intellectual energy by which humans operate, became colonized as well. The university is not an apolitical and neutral ground for the creation and dissemination of progressive ideas, as revisionist Enlightenment narratives purport. It has always functioned as an instrument of the state to produce knowledge for capitalism and empire. This manifests not only by converting the colonies into objects of scrutiny and discipline, but by creating the conditions that facilitate the forced or voluntary migration of colonial subjects to the imperial center, so that they may be taught into workers of the empire. For instance, a majority of students who graduated from the university would go on to work as colonial officers, medical or otherwise, for the Imperial Navy or Army, but not only. Many other students would choose to leave university to work in the arts, trade unionism, writing, and other fields more or less detached from colonial projects. In light of the explicit link between the university and empire, as the Vice-Chancellor's words clearly state, Uncovered recognized the impossibility of illuminating the names and stories of past alumni of color without recognizing, addressing, and critiquing the university's imperial context. The student biographies converged into a broader picture of mobility and circulation within the empire, which the university seeks to erase. As we looked through the archive tellingly, after the 1940s, the language of imperiality all but disappeared from the archives as the language of globality emerged. In truth, the university was always something of a global institution, as much as imperial. Uncovered found that the reworking and rewording of the University of Edinburgh's history in terms of globality was effectively an exercise to further cover up the imperial matrix of the institution. It is important we pay attention to uses of globalized language by the university, when all they really mean is imperial. Global modernity is a colonially produced and domination-driven ideology layered in imperiality, as Frederick Cooper states in Colonialism in Question, where he maintains that the fiction of globalization is a convenient narrative that obscures rather than clarifies the imperial underpinnings and workings of colonial capitalism. The university occupies the same role as it did in the 1800s and 1900s. So decolonizing today needs to take a practical anti-imperialist approach to organize resistance against the presently colonial project of the university. As Arun Kundnani put it, the university continues to play its role in the neo-colonial circuits of capital and violence. It still provides the UK national security state with discourses of counterinsurgency, racist theories of culture, cultural surveillance of populations subject to neo-colonialism, and so on. The old colonial patterns in a new form. This is all to suggest, wearily but not cynically, that the premise of decolonization within the university may be an illusory one, perhaps even deceiving. Decolonization is not a metaphor, Tuck and Young stated. Rather, it is a profound unsettling, nothing short of a material shift. The work done by UncoverEd The work done by UncoverEd has and can too easily be co-opted by the university, which is not to mean that the work has been for nothing. If anything, we have collected stories that we can now hope to bring outside of the institution. The university is only going to consume the stories of the people whose names we uncovered and whose lives we distilled in short biographies for the institution's website and exhibition halls. They are far more important, far more precious than what the capitalist, imperial, global project of the university can make of them. We point here to decolonizing as a marketing practice by the university. While the university wished to present UncoverEd as an exercise of diversity, equality, and inclusivity within academia, the team has realized the importance of controlling the project's trajectory and preserving its integrity to prevent the university from using the archives to source and brand promotional material for its financial goals, effectively exploiting the language of decoloniality for its own institutional expansion. The university's interest in funding a permanent website and a temporary exhibition for UncoverEd speaks directly to the need by the University of Edinburgh for easily marketed content. When then can knowledge be said to be decolonized? At what point can the process be said to have begun? Are the efforts of a project like UncoverEd merely symbolic or ultimately unproductive and reproductive of the same colonial orders of knowledge? What bigger material goal is UncoverEd working towards? These are questions we ponder. UncoverEd wants to engage with pedagogy more, but with communities outside the institution. Universities hold the power and interests of the state over that of people by creating divides between those who produce knowledge and those who consume it passively, which is a deeply colonial principle. Universities serve an intellectualized crisis instead of yielding power, i.e. funding communities. They are not interested in liberation struggles, as they are far removed from the social realities of people. Counterinsurgency work by the university can often masquerade as realism, pacifies, to pacify, manage resistance and dissent. Universities can become smarter colonial instruments. We must resist its instruments by unlearning colonial logics reproduced by the university and creating spaces for this communal and collective unlearning. Learning socially and politically engaged values that oppose those logics towards extra-institutional spaces to make the university redundant. The conception of a decolonial university is premised on the idea that the university can change, spurring on counterinsurgency by the desire to maintain the institution of authority, culturally, politically, economically. We must provoke self-reflection deep within ourselves. Where are the ideas of the sacredness of the university kept? Why are we centering knowledge and pedagogy on institutions known to be exclusive? All of this is premised on the revisionism of history that he raises colonialism from the narrative of the university. Uncover Ed may need to remove itself from the university in order to truly uphold a radical vision for transformative pedagogy. This would involve restructuring our objectives as a movement. To be truly decolonial is not simply to catalog the names and experiences of people of color who have attended the university. It is to challenge the epistemicide of knowledge from colonized spaces and interrogate the hegemonic idea of what education is. We must ask, which way of learning is prioritized over which other ways? How can we support those other ways? Uncover Ed has the potential to become a provocative agent to challenge the presence of capital as objective in learning spaces. We can confront the commodification of ideas, people, and land, all for the sake of accumulating power and wealth for a very select group of people. Capitalism is driven by the creation of difference in society. In order to have the rich, one must have the poor. Likewise, in order to have the educated, one must have the uneducated. An anti-capitalist and decolonial pedagogical framework approaches difference differently. We must embrace pluriversality, not inclusion, difference as a strength, not something to be exploited. Ultimately, through the example of our own work, movements to decolonize can engage in a critical appraisal of how, in their work, they either dismantle or uphold logics of empire and coloniality. The university cannot be the site of decolonization, or the colonial cannot decolonize itself. A project like Uncover Ed, which was created for a very specific instrumental need, represents an institutional intervention on the part of the university to reduce the colonial history of people moving through the power structures of institution to a whitewashed narrative of globality that does not account for the material processes that make up its reality. We know that our work, if it is to be truly decolonial, cannot just be about uncovering the stories of alumni. It has to be about removing itself from the colonial center of power, i.e. the university, as methodology. Anything short of that has to be called what it is: management work for the colonial institution.
So we have here Dave Thomas, who is an occupational therapist who specializes in occupational science, a public health specialist, and a doctoral researcher. He previously managed the University of Kent's Student Success Project, which conducts research on the inequalities in academic attainment and develops interventions to improve a student's educational experiences and academic outcomes. His current research adopts a race-focused approach in exploring the relationship between university students' perceptions of the cultural sensitivity of the curriculum of their program of study and their engagement as measured by their interaction with teachers and their interest in their program of study. He has developed and validated a novel set of culturally sensitive curricular scales and interaction with teacher scales to enable students in post-secondary education to measure the impact of the curriculum's unacknowledged whiteness on their engagement and overall achievement. So I'd also just like to highlight that Dave is here as the lead editor of Doing Equity and Diversity for Success in Higher Education, a book that is to be published in, I want to say May.
Yeah.
Is that right? Right, May. And several of our speakers over the course of the day have also contributed chapters, myself included, to this edited collection. A book that illuminates the dynamic interplay between historical events and discourse and more sophisticated and racialized acts of violences. So thank you so much for being here, Dave. And yes, now the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rihanna. You know what, it humbles me so much, to hear all those words being spoken previous to me speaking, and sometimes I don't even recognize those words, if I'm being honest, but I believe that they're true, so thank you so much. The first thing that I will do, because culturally this is something that's really, really important. So let me just position myself. So I am, as you know, Dave Thomas. I identify as he, him. I'm a Black man. I was born in Jamaica, Kingston, Jamaica. I'm Jamaica's finest export, right? Oh, sorry, along with Rihanna. So, and for people who are religious, I'm God's favorite son. I'm the favorite one, the one who gets punished the hardest, but gets praised the most, right? But on a serious note, so yeah, so that positions me a little bit, right? The first thing I normally do is to give gratitude, because that is, as I said, that's quite personal, quite close to me. So I'm giving gratitude to all those who have done this work previous to me, all those who are doing this work, and all those who will do this work. So we can't go any further forward without acknowledging these efforts, because it's because of those efforts that we are able to actually embark on this work now. So I want to do that. And then before I go any further, I also want to give a very, very special gratitude to the late Dame Jocelyn Anita Barrow. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I had the privilege of crossing paths with Dame Jocelyn before her passing, and you know, her inspiration is what motivated me certainly to put together the last book, Doing Equity and Diversity for Success in Higher Education. So she inspired me to do that, and the book is dedicated to her. So I just want to say that up front. I had also the privilege of working with her before her passing to compose a chapter, and the chapter is in the book. And it is in what I would say a sort of decolonial way, right? It's a conversation. So it wasn't the traditional way how academic chapters are constructed, but we did work together and we did compose a chapter, and that is there. So for people who don't know, Dame Jocelyn is the pioneer of what was called multicultural education in Britain, right? And this is back in the 70s. So it is on the back of this multicultural education that we're having some of these conversations around liberating education and decolonizing education, right? So it's a similar thing, right? And this is often not celebrated. You know, I noticed recently when a decision was made for Black history to be taught in the Welsh curriculum, that there was no acknowledgement of the work that people like the late, great Dame Jocelyn Barrow undertook in the 70s. So I just want to highlight that there. I don't want to be political in saying that, but this is a personal thing for me. What I also want to say is, and I'll speak about liberating the curriculum, and I'll speak about diversifying the curriculum, but what I would also want to do is to challenge you to think about what that actually means. So what does it mean to liberate the curriculum? And, you know, persons can put their answers. There's no right answer, by the way, right? Put their answers in the chat, because that will actually help me to understand how you're thinking about these things. And also, I would want you to think about what it means to decolonize the curriculum. That's a big question, and that's a big undertaking, right? So if we look at decolonization, are we looking at decolonization as a noun, right? Or are we looking at decolonize as the verb? So I know that's been a little bit provocative, but what exactly do we mean when we're talking about, you know, decolonization or decolonize? Are we referring to decolonize the noun, the verb, sorry, or decolonization, the noun? And in a similar manner, are we referring to liberate, or are we referring to liberation? Because it's really important to be clear about what we're talking about. Now, in the book, the forthcoming publication that Rihanna contributed to, one of our colleagues, Michelle Guru, a professor from the University of California in San Diego, she wrote about decolonizing the institution, right? So really, really encouraging us to look at the process, right? What is it that we're trying to do? Are we trying to diversify, or are we trying to decolonize, right? What can you do? How can you get started? Another set of important questions. As I spoke about half an hour ago, when we think about the process of liberation or decolonization, is it okay to do an aspect of that and celebrate that as success? Or should we just dismantle the structure and start again? You know, how do we operationalize these aspects? So let me see. For me, one is a process driven, while others is an outcome specific. Adrian, that's what you said. Is that decolonize and decolonization? Is that what you were referring to?
Yeah, like with regards to the noun and the verb. So like one I attribute to the process of decolonization, and the other one is kind of like the what you want to achieve. Okay.
But you see, my question, to answer your question, is another question. To what extent is there a shared understanding amongst us as practitioners on the ground, or advocates, or allies, or activists? Yeah. To what extent is there a shared understanding of this, you know, this dichotomy between the noun and the verb?
I think that's where the complexity comes. So that's why I said, like, in my opinion, because when you were describing yourself, your name, your gender identity, etc., you're creating your kind of, that's your lived experience. You're kind of expressing kind of part of like how your lived experience is constructed around those things, being male, being black, etc., and that's just one lens, and I think the whole conversation is kind of like we appreciating everybody's lens is really, really complex.
Thank you so much, Adrian. And that's really important to understand. I like the everybody in that, you know, statement, right? And the lenses, so it's in myriad ways, right? This happens in myriad ways. So I also want to explore the idea of, you know, who does it and who is it for? You know, so is it decolonization for the university or by the university? Because again, or liberation for, liberation by, or liberation from, you know, really important questions for us to think about when we're thinking about these, you know, huge undertakings. And then once we get past these questions, I'll actually speak to you about how I, you know, frame these understandings, really. But you need to speak to me, really. I've only had one person speaking to me, and it works better if both of us speak, right? Because, you know, look, I'm still learning. Just to make a declaration here, I'm still learning, and I want to learn from you as well, so as you learn from me. This is actually what we're doing, is a decolonizing methodology here, or a liberating methodology, right? So when we speak about liberating, you know, the curricula, or decolonizing the curricula, or even the verb noun sort of dichotomy, who is it for, or who is it by? What exactly are we talking about? And in terms of liberation, liberating from what? What is it that we're speaking about?
That question to the group.
To the group, yes. It works better if everyone chips in, right? Because we're developing shared understandings. Liberating the curricular classroom is about creating a space for difficult conversations or difficult discussions that address the saliences through history. Yes, this is important. But difficult conversations for who? Liberate us all from whiteness, coloniality, dehumanizing thinking. Sophia, that is excellent, because I spot the dehumanizing right there. And, you know, Archbishop Desmond Tutu spoke about something. He said, when you dehumanize a person, you become dehumanized in that process. So if you think about that, by dehumanizing a person, you become dehumanized in that person. So you can never be fully human if you are dehumanizing someone. That was very interesting hearing that. So the dehumanizing thinking is really important to liberate us from, you know, that sort of thinking. Anyone else with anything about that? And so, okay, so let me share my philosophy with you. So I'll speak a little bit about the book. And in speaking about the book, I'll intersperse some of my own philosophies, right? So the book is composed of 25 chapters. And within these 25 chapters, we explore a selection of themes. So first of all, we have Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, who's the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. And he's also one of the chairpersons of the Reparation Committee, right? Who did the work in University of Glasgow, exploring their links to the transatlantic slave trade. And Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, he spoke about the empire being dead. So he said, dead is the empire, buried is its pedagogy, and the pedagogy should be buried. So basically what he's speaking about is the whole idea of the university and how we teach in the university. It is dead, it's gone. We need to move past that now. We need to recreate or reimagine a new reality, reimagine how that can be done. Okay, imagine how that can be done. We also have, as I said, a section looking at a review of the past and a look into the future. So importantly, what we believe is if diversity and equity and liberating the curricula is supposed to be done, we need to review the past in order to reimagine a future, right? And as part of looking into the past, we're looking at a diverse society and how we can create solutions for that diverse society. So Professor Sir Jeff Palmer spoke in his chapter about a diverse society needing diverse solutions, which is critically important. But fundamentally, he speaks about being able to develop system consciousness. So what is system consciousness? System consciousness is about being acutely aware of the system in which you operate and the limits of the system, you know, what can be done within the system and how it can be done. And so we also looked at how we travel between historical memory and the current predicament of educational reforms. So in terms of looking at liberating the curriculum, to what extent are educational reforms a part of that process of liberating the curriculum, right? Again, we explored the conundrum, right, between equity, diversity, inclusivity, liberation, and decolonization. This indeed, I believe, is a conundrum, right? As I mentioned before, what is it that we're doing? What is the shared understanding? How can we expedite these understandings in practice? Really important for us to be clear about what we're doing, but also important to understand that this process is not a one-lane highway. It doesn't have to be the same. It's not everything for everyone. I think Miriam spoke about that in their chapter. Decolonization cannot be everything for everyone, right? It is a conundrum, of course. But what we need to do is to move beyond diversity to promote racial equity in this sense, right? So in my understanding, the diversity is about ensuring that we have representation, right? Intersectionally, we have representation. But we have to move beyond that now. So this is the call to action, to move beyond that diversity. And then my colleague, Sandeep Bakshi, he spoke about unmaking canons. So as part of this liberating the curriculum, to what extent are we able to unmake the canons, to remake it, right? And then how does merit and success work in terms of epistemic logic? How does merit, what constitutes merit? But one of the most important aspects of the collection that we put together was the investigation of student-led interventions in the UK. and the extent to which these student-led activism have been effective in initiating and stimulating conversations towards change. That was really important. So, in the end, what I'm suggesting here is that there are myriad ways to look at this phenomenon. There are different approaches, but clarity is really important. And also, as someone mentioned earlier, it's about humanizing thinking, not dehumanizing, humanizing thinking. What does it mean to be fully human? And how, to what extent does decolonizing the academy contribute to that process of humanizing the persons who operate within the academy? So I'll leave you with those questions. For me, there are more questions here than answers, to be fair, right? But importantly, I think one fundamental aspect here in our conversations is to understand the differences and the dichotomy and, the conundrum between this process of equity, equality, diversity, decolonizing, liberating. What is it that we are doing? What do we want to do? How do we do it? Who does it? And who is it for? Who does it and who is it for, right? Just to think about those in context. I think that's probably it from me. Does anyone have any suggestions or any questions?
Thank you for that, Dave. We're going to actually jump into a brief break before we come back to our final panel of the day. So thank you very much for that. I would definitely encourage everyone to go and take a look at that book once it is available. What's the publication date, Dave?
At the moment, we're looking at the 18th of May. And, as I said, if for those who don't know about it yet, please get to know about it. And there's a blockbuster chapter there by Rihanna in that book. So
yeah, thanks. Well, I'll be posting some links in the chat about that. And honestly, it's just such a really wonderful all-star lineup in there. Like, we've got a lot of people that Project Myopia have worked with over the years, a lot of representatives from the NUS, lots of staff and student collaborations in there, and also, most importantly, lots of people from different parts of their career, from a mixture of early career researchers, but as well as established right up to professor. So I think that it is actually a really wonderful way to, a wonderful and recent look at the academy. So yeah, definitely recommend taking a look.
Sorry, Rihanna. I think one of the things I didn't mention though is, that wasn't accidental. That was deliberate, because I realized, and again, through the wisdom of the late great Dame Jocelyn Barrow, I realized that the gatekeepers often hold the reins very tightly, and you have young, aspiring, intelligent researchers similar to yourself, Rihanna, who have to fight to get in through these gates. And I wanted to create an environment where we can just diversify our thoughts and introduce the silenced voices. And I have to thank Professor Jason Arday for providing that platform to make this happen, because this was just a weird conversation I was having with Jason, right? Trust me, it was an ad hoc conversation, and I told him about this idea, not even to write a book, and he said, well, why don't you put together a proposal? Literally, I can't believe it actually happened, but I'm so grateful that it happened, because it gives voices to people who are often silenced and get disenchanted before they can actually actualize their voices. So really, I'm really so proud of the publication, but I'm even more proud that you guys entrusted me with your scholarship, because that for me meant quite a lot, and now it's happening. So thank you so much.
Definitely. And I know that the book also had a difficult road, it being us pulling it together over the pandemic. So I'm really glad to see that it's on its way to being published. Okay, hi, welcome back, guys. We're here for the home run. It's the last part of the conference. Thank you so much to everyone who's stuck with us to this point. Hope it's been well worth your while. So we're delighted to introduce the last of our speakers again. Dave Thomas, Hannah McGurk, and Lisa Williams. We'll pick up where we started off. So if you guys wouldn't mind, cameras on and unmuting. So we're going to pick up where we started off, where I left us with Hannah's question. So the last thing I asked you, Hannah, was about if you had any advice for Black and Brown students who were being asked and encouraged to do this kind of work. Do you have any thoughts for us as someone who's juggling everything in the world?
Yeah, so I was so all over the place the first time you asked, but like my short answer is like I wish we didn't have to do it, and I kind of wish I'd done less in some ways. But the main point was, I think for me it was really about finding community and finding solidarity and finding people I had things in common with and could get along with. And I think that's also important to these movements for like sustainability. And so in terms of advice, it's like knowing that you're not on your own, that you don't have to take all of this work on by yourself, and that there's always other people doing this work and have been doing this work. So mostly to find them and rely on them. And don't let yourself like get taken advantage of and get paid.
See, this is the thing, that bit about not getting it taken advantage of as well. I think I started to feel, I had a conversation with a friend about, you know, almost feeling guilt when I wasn't doing this kind of work and when I was just having peace and looking after my plants and things, and finding that I was constantly wrapped up in this. And I had realized from what this friend said to me that I'd allowed my Blackness to become bound up in struggle and to be like completely inextricable from doing that work and from literally struggling all the time and having to fight with people constantly. And I would just really love to see, like, for me, it would be wonderful when we're allowed to be mediocre and when we're allowed to not do this. When you go through university and you go to the, like, I know that the Afro-Caribbean Society, ACS is always for partying, and then the BME group is always for liberation struggles, which is certainly how it was at Edinburgh.
I did both.
Yeah, we all do a little bit of both. We all go to both. But it would be really nice if we were allowed to just like enjoy, and have fun in the way that a lot of other people do.
Yeah, something I've been thinking about a lot recently is just like making my politics fun and making these movements fun, making all of this work fun and something that brings people together. If someone asked me to do, like, I can't come to any more EDI meetings, I can't sit on any more like boards and like that is dull, but I will have a party or a book club and get people to come and chat about things they're interested and excited in, and that's what I want Uncover to be like moving towards as well.
Definitely. How can we make our activism and this kind of work that we're so physically bound up in, like, how can we make it something that's pleasurable? I completely agree. Thank you for that. Does anyone else, either of you, Lisa or Dave, have anything you'd like to add to that? Yeah,
I would totally agree with that, actually, because I kind of err on the edge of getting burnt out as well, because I don't always have that balance. I think one of the things is we talk about self-care and so on, but this, how to create channels of community care that's easy to access and make sense. And people don't feel guilty about kind of putting their burdens on someone else, you know what I mean? To actually set those things up so that we can keep each other going in whatever ways that is, and, take advantage of that. I think that's important.
Absolutely.
Yeah, if I may jump in, I agree with everything that has been said previously, but 2-3 things I'll say. Firstly, find communities and connect with people. And how do you do that, right? The way I've had the privilege of, in the last 2 years, I easily would have spoken to over 2,000 students in the last 2 years, easily, because that's just what I do, right? But what they all have in common, or what all the interactions have in common, is that I have to find them where they are. So what I'm saying here is that gone are the days where you send a telegram to someone or you get a letter in the mail, right? People are where they are. In terms of finding communities, find them where they are. Now, Rihanna is a perfect example. I've never met Rihanna in the flesh. I found her where she was. There was a time when I was looking for solace. I was investigating BME, mental health, and I found the book, The Color of Madness. I read that book and I'm like, wow. And I reached out to Rihanna on Twitter, and
Twitter is where I am always.
Exactly. A year later, we've collaborated, we've worked together, and we've had a great relationship, working relationship. So what I'm saying here is that find communities where they are, because people are there, like-minded people. And the second thing is look after yourself. This work is hard, Anyone that wants to do anything in social justice, it gets to you. A colleague said to me day before yesterday, not because you don't think you're being watched, it doesn't mean that you're not watched. That was a scary thing she said. I'm like, what do you mean? It means that I'm watched. She said, well, who knows? So what I'm saying here, this work gets to you, everyone, but it's life. Life is happening. So look after yourself. Take time to look after yourself. Don't even take yourself that silly, right? Take time to laugh. Live a little, because life is happening as we speak. But look after your mental health. This is a tough gig. And the third thing is, connecting with communities is good, but build these relationships. When you find people like you, don't let go of them, because they're rare. Keep the relationships precious, and it will keep you over. Develop your networks. In my PhD, I can tell you a lot of the sources that I read, I find them on Twitter. Can you imagine? Someone send you something on Twitter, or you see someone post their new article, and everything is there. Social media is the way forward. I'm not suggesting that that's the only thing you should do, but what I'm suggesting is that we have communities here, connect with people, and maintain those healthy relationships.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Dave. I mean, the nature of these community spaces as well is very much implicit in both of the other panelists' work, Hannah being a student and part of all of those different communities and Uncover Ed and Project Myopia. But also, the other project, Fringe of Colour, which I think deserves a shout out here, another Edinburgh-based project that's about bringing diversity and, to the Fringe Festival and highlighting performers of colour. That started from a spreadsheet that my friend Jess Brough started, a few years ago. So that's the sort of thing where we have these communities that coalesce around certain movements and around certain problems, but then also become, more empathic spaces that are also of friendship and support. And I certainly know that I wouldn't have been able to get through part of this PhD. I'm not done yet, but I certainly wouldn't be where I was without these groups of people around me. So, and again, here with Lisa Williams as well, and, the kind of community space that she's created in these Black history walks around Edinburgh, a space that is predominantly white, but that, in centering the Caribbean and centering Black people in it, you've built a community around that. So thank you. And that's a very good point about how we can find each other in this work and support each other in this work. So I have another question. Sorry, Rihanna.
You said about Black History Walks. Is it Lisa? Lisa, are you aware of what Professor Les Henry does and Professor Les Back?
Yeah.
Connect with them, because that's powerful, right? Connect with those two people.
Yeah.
So, absolutely. Networking live. So we have another question here from Adrian Porter. I'm interested in the tipping point. I think this was aimed at Lisa Williams. So Lisa, if you want taking this question. I'm interested in the tipping point for the shift from the imperial educational structure to what we're discussing now, which seems in the first instance far more organic and therefore complex. What are the conversations that I need to start within my own organization and our validating university? I'm also acutely aware that this work must begin before our population gets to higher education, which is again something that's really important for all of us. Early years, primary and secondary education must be implicated, and this fills me with dread. That's so true. I've often thought about how Project Myopia needs to next tackle secondary education, but that would mean taking on the government, and I just don't know if we're ready yet in terms of thinking about the national curriculum. I'm there, I'm ready, but do we have the resources yet? Because I personally noted that the English literature curriculum has gotten even less diverse from when I was doing it, where the AQA anthology that used to have loads of Caribbean poetry in it now has practically nothing, and it's all wartime poetry, which is absolutely gutting. But yes, this question was aimed at you, Lisa. And it was talking about the imperial educational structure as it is?
Yeah, I mean, I'll probably take it from the sort of back end of the question maybe first, because one of the other things that I do is anti-racist training and looking at changing the curriculum with a lot of teachers up here. So I'm often in conversation with primary school teachers and secondary school teachers. Now, the differences between Scotland and the rest of the UK is that we do have more flexibility within the curriculum. There is more official support, supposedly, in the statements that come out from Scottish Government about bringing back history and decolonising the curriculum and so on. So there should be theoretically more freedom to do that, and within the curriculum for excellence, it's kind of up to the teacher almost what they teach, right? There isn't really a national curriculum as such. So there's room for that. And there's a lot of teachers that I come across who do want to change and bring in different things. And the main thing is about providing a resource that people feel really confident in. Now, the thing about working with primary schools and secondary schools, having said that, and then of course the rest of the UK is a whole other ball game, right? I think we really do have to go back to that community school, everything that was developed in the 1960s and 1970s and was literally just a living room with people getting together in their living room, but creating funding structures within that so that we can hold on to a certain amount of power, a certain amount of democracy within that has to go parallel to the education system. Because really, I think it's always going to be tied to what government wants their different demographics in the society, to what function they want them to fulfill. It's not Cuba. So I think we still have to make sure that we put a lot of time and energy and our own money into funding those alternatives. So at least when young people are in school, they've got a very strong sense of who they are, their own history, and they are able to, critique the teacher and actually be able to come up with certain evidence and so on. So I do think that is a really important thing that we must keep on, and also then network throughout the country as well. So if we can strengthen that in our own communities, but also be able to network with each other online and also bring in, let's say, teachers in the Caribbean or teachers in other places in the world where we can kind of extend that conversation. And it's not even just within the country.
Absolutely. And of course, we know that there are some organizations that are very much geared towards this kind of alternative education work, like Free Black University, as mentioned, the Black curriculum, Project Myopia.
Yeah.
So Samira has also just popped in the chat. Also, the global curriculum. I went to secondary school in Pakistan, where the Cambridge International examinations dominate O and A levels.
Yeah.
Thinking of the ways in which the curriculum is so distorted through the colonial lens globally is frightening.
That's true.
Definitely a really good point. So there's another part of that question that I'd like to just tease out for us here. What are the conversations that I need to start within my own organization and our validating university? I think, just so we could have some sort of practical or tangible things to take away for our audience, like what kinds of conversations who should we be talking to?
You know what, Rihanna, you asked that question, and I'm sort of reflecting on the last hour and a half presenting that research to that group just now. But you know what, I think the first people who we should be talking to in our institutions are the people responsible for putting these curricula together, right? So directors of education, people who are module conveners, those sorts of people. But the most important people are and I use this word in a very clumsy way, the consumers of this curriculum. So we need to be talking to students as well, right? What are their perspectives and their perceptions of this curriculum? And we need to be documenting this, because in the absence of this documentation, it becomes anecdotal conversations, right? And those just won't work. Those will be dismissed as just lamentations by people of color, right? So we don't want that. What we want is for these curricula to be evaluated, and this evaluation through documentation be presented, sort of like a business case, to the people who are creating these curricula, right? The directors of education, module conveners. But what we also want is practical tools to assist these people to revise, review, reimagine their curriculum. Because the thing is, this has been instituted for so many years, right? And it's hard to shift these things. So you want to shape praxis. So what I presented earlier, and I'm not marketing my research by any means, right? So please excuse me. But what I presented is the idea that diversity shouldn't just be represented in a curriculum. It's not enough just to represent diversity. It's not a, as I call it, cosmetic diversity, window dressing. That's not what we're after. What I believe is you should have positive portrayals of this diversity within your curriculum. And the curriculum should be an instrument that empowers students to challenge the hegemonic power structures, right? The things that we take for granted. And ultimately, you want the curriculum to shape inclusive classroom interactions somehow. So how do educators do this? Who do you speak to? As you said, go back to your question. You need to speak to the people who are the custodians, but also suggest practical tools, practical strategies in which they can do this reflection on this curriculum. I think that's the only way we can start these conversations.
Thank you. Well, for those practical tools and strategies, I really think that we should be looking to what Lisa has to say about pedagogical practice, because I was so fascinated by, the whole way that you mapped out that talk, and in particular, some of what you said about, how you have to be reflexive as you go, and the ways in which you manage the people on the talk, you precipitate sort of, what was the word you used? I've already forgotten the word you used.
Anticipating the whataboutery.
Thank you. Anticipating the whataboutery. That was it. It's fantastic. Because when I just thought about, the moment you said whataboutery, I was already imagining my least favorite classroom interaction where someone's playing the devil's advocate in a space where it's completely inappropriate to do so.
Yeah.
So I thought that was wonderful. And I just think I really would like to hear more about what you had said to me on the phone, even about healing and the praxis of care, and how you take that sort of element of pastoral care and bind it up with your pedagogy. Yeah,
sure. And I suppose the other bit of my experience I didn't really bring into this, but it's actually relevant now I think about it, is spending a long time running groups of meditation, stress management and things like that, where you're getting quite a random, not really random, but you're getting an uncontrolled group of people coming together, different experiences and attitudes and so on. And you have to kind of very quickly, I would say manage is kind of the wrong word, because it's not necessarily about me steering it in a controlling kind of way, but there are certain things that I don't want in that space to ruin that space or ruin certain people's experience. So yes, there is an element of control within that. So it's a kind of space that you create. So that thing about, creating a supportive space, there's always talk about safe space, what makes a safe space, what makes a brave space, what makes a supportive space, or I suppose we'll call it a supportive space. So most of the people that are coming on the tour are doing it because they want to learn, they're not against it in any kind of way, they're not really coming to give trouble. But there's occasionally you'll get certain people that will make objectionable remarks. So you've got to deal with quite quickly, and you have to have a certain amount of confidence to be able to spin that around. Not even shame the person at that point, but just quickly deconstruct their argument at that time. So they're not going to keep challenging on it as you're walking around. But yeah, it's about setting the scene when people first come. So it's about explaining, like I said, during the talk, it's about preparing people for different emotions that come up. And sometimes I'm surprised at the people that get a bit tearful about something, or because you don't know their experience, you don't know their personality, whatever, so you can't judge. But there are certain moments where people get very, very touched by things, or they feel a sense of anger, or sometimes when we're looking at imagery, like when we might go into the National Galleries and we're looking at images of people who are oppressive. And what I'm trying to do is really don't leave people always with that psychic impression of oppressors as they're going around. So let's say we talk about, for example, there's a Scottish enslaver who ended up being the rector of Glasgow University at some point, Cunningham Graham Gartmore, massive painting of him in the National Gallery, but somehow managed to link it to Marcus Garvey, because Marcus Garvey's ancestors used to toil on one of his plantations. So I kind of spin it around. So before we leave, they have an image of Marcus Garvey, and we're talking about Pan-Africanism and so on. So people kind of are empowered leaving with that, so they don't feel drained and feel constantly reoppressed when they're doing this kind of tour. So there's that kind of things that I'm starting to bring in. But it's also gauging the emotional temperature of the group as well, and kind of working with that and trying to keep people uplifted as we go around as well.
I do think that reflexivity in your pedagogy is like really important. Like that's something that I'm constantly urging educators to do, to like, you know, there's no, and what I tried to get across with that workshop earlier is that there's no one size fits all approach to managing your classroom, but the praxis of care centers, you know, the students and centers the educational experience in a way that means that it's not going to be completely prescriptive. It means that you can learn together and grow together and make it. And I really just love how you're aware and holding space for different emotions that might come up. Because a lot of us teach very political subjects, and even if you're not, the classroom is political. It's a political space. You can't leave it at all. So, you know, and I think that establishing the boundaries of the space and the rules of the space before you begin is like a really meaningful part of teaching, you know. So that,
and also how you wrap it up at the end as well. So it's all about how you contain it to leave, because you don't want to leave people ragged and undone. And that can happen often in a classroom, as we know.
Oh, definitely. In fact,
it's very disruptive.
Definitely. And like what can you do? This is something that I think about a lot, because a friend of mine is in a class that I, you know, when we were living together, I was seeing this class happen, and I was just taken aback by how much sensitivity was approaching this class. It was an MA Black History course that my friend Paula Akpan was in. And I just noted that during the class, it was a predominantly Black class, you know, the teacher was Black, and I just noted so many differences in the way that class was conducted to how I might have seen it being conducted in a predominantly white institution. So for example, like after a particularly heavy class discussing something like race, colorism, you know, like sexuality in a way that was difficult for the class participants, they also held a decompression space afterwards where they could talk about how the class made them feel, and, you know, not the strictly academic stuff. So they weren't just like hurled out into the world afterwards to go about with the trauma that they'd potentially
had. Very important.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that. And I have a question that I'm actually going to aim to Hannah. Oh, sorry, Hannah, were you just about to speak?
I had a question for Lisa, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just would love to hear, Lisa, like we've been talking about like decolonising the university all day, and I was wondering what your attitude is to that, because you have this community space and this your teaching style that you've developed. So I was wondering like how that conversation is, how you think about it, how it's relevant to you, or are you interested?
Yeah, it's interesting for me because I've got one foot, a couple of toes in the university. I'm not an academic, I'm not paid there, but I'm an honorary fellow and I get to go to events. I'm part of stuff that's there. But then I'm more really on the outside with the community. So it's interesting for me being in those sort of two camps in that way, right? I think there's a few things, right? So I am really interested in, you know, what we've all been talking about. At what point and where those certain aspects of decolonising strengthen the institution, but in a way that is, you can't really claw that back again. Or if there's something that we put in place down the road to make sure that it doesn't just strengthen the institution, then we just sort of leave it there and we're kind of like fixing up their institution for them, right? So I'm very concerned about that. And this whole thing about co-opting the decolonisation process and it turning into extractive so-called decolonisation. The other thing I think is really important as well is it's easy to look at the past. We know that, of course, colonialism morphed into neo-colonialism. And I'm just thinking about an event the other day that Hakim Adi was in. He was talking about the fact that actual decolonisation was a benefit to the former imperial powers, but only once those neo-colonial structures were then put in place, right? So what I'm thinking about too is that we have to, as all these universities really have to come to terms with complicity in neo-colonial structures and the arms trade, and being funded by countries and bodies that are, creating human rights abuses across the world and things like that. I think that's something we're still not really looking at as strongly as we should be, and what kinds of influences are happening underneath as well. What else was I going to say? There's so much to this. Another thing I wanted to ask as well, is throwing a question back. A lot of us are doing this today. This thing about epistemological change and examples, because people have asked me, what would be an example of positive epistemological change that you would want to see, or that has happened in the past, or something that you see would be really beneficial? So that's the piece of decolonising I'm kind of interested in as well.
I think I'm just going to give like a tiny thing that I think about that isn't a huge example of epistemological change, but kind of change. Thinking about a change to the institution and the culture of marking that I would like to see, that I think would be a safer and more supportive space for marginalised academics. Stuff like, I would like to see more clarity around, say when you're marking an essay and you've got something that is problematic, like there are, something racist or something transphobic or whatever, something has come across your attention in this essay. There's no real way within university structures to deal with that, particularly if it's something that's born out of if it's born out of ignorance, or it's like just a little bit, just a dash of racism. There's no real way that looks at, one, protecting the academics who have to read it, if you are a minority academic, which, I think is part and parcel in them not expecting us to be there. So if I have to read a racist essay, no one's thinking, a black academic might have to come across this. Is there a way I can support her? Because they just don't think I'm there. And that has happened to me in the past. But also things like, there's no real way within the mark scheme to address that. It's more about, when I have talked about it in the past, the way that people say it is like, but was it an academically rigorous essay? Were the sources used properly? Was it, did it critically meet the sort of the parameters of an academic essay, without really thinking about, was it ethical? Did it perpetuate harm? Did it subscribe to a way of thinking that we don't want a space for in academia? Yeah. And I just wished that there could be some way of putting in that moral aspect, or that, that ethical part, that the vision of the university that we want to take part in, and that the way that could be reinscribed in the way that we mark things. Another thing that I think about is like academic tone and academic language, and the way that comes more naturally to some than others, and the way that reinscribes, again, a very colonial perspective. I've been helping out with some hiring panels in the last few weeks at my institution, and I suppose one of the things that is interesting to me and that I feel is that I don't always want to talk like an academic. Sometimes I'd like to express myself in another way, in a way that's more comfortable and real to me. And honestly, just being in these spaces where, you've got white candidates speaking in a way that is not always, it's quite to me, every time I say pedagogy or epistemology, a little trickle of sweat goes down my back. That's the truth, and I've said it a lot today. The hackles are raising. I am uncomfortable. I didn't learn what praxis actually. I've been using praxis for years. I still have a very vague understanding of what it means. I think that there's a lot of stuff a lot of mantles that we put on.
So maybe we don't need. Yeah.
Maybe we don't need these words. Maybe I could just say practice. That's what I think it means anyway. Why am I saying practice anyway? So, I think all of these sorts of things, but I also think about, how students might want to use I and the first person voice in their essays, especially when it comes to talking about lived experience, and how we don't value lived experience as epistemology. I think it's one of those things where if we could, broaden our understanding of what is academic to include lived experience and include those perspectives, it would probably give us a nicer and more comfortable academy. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to add to us before we close to that question about how to communicate with the university to get what we need and want?
Yeah, I've got a comment on that as well. Like, I think this is something that we've talked about before, Rihanna and Hannah, together as a group, because my background is in life sciences. My master's was in biodiversity conservation, and I now strongly believe that I just don't think that conservation as a study can be decolonized. I don't think that's possible. And I don't put those words together anymore. I try and call it different things, which doesn't make it sound like a euphemism. And yeah, when I was doing my master's, I would constantly be talking about these things with my very white teachers and classmates. And it was just one teacher who, I think she saw what I was trying to say, and I looked at, had that humility to be able to say, like, oh, my curriculum actually is lacking. I don't have these global perspectives in a degree which is called global biodiversity conservation. It was through conversations with her that she actually gave me the platform and the space to speak to my peers and my fellow students about it. So sometimes it just takes one person, and that can light the fire into keep having those conversations. But after today, after having worked with Project Myopia for over a year, the key thing that I have found is that sometimes you can't go to the custodians. It's not possible. And world building, co-creating, storytelling, those are the tools that we actually have. Those are the decolonial tools. And we've seen so many examples of that today. We've talked about the Free Black University. We've talked about Fringe of Color. To me, all of those projects, and of course, Project Myopia, to me, all of these projects are they are eliminating the whole need for custodians, and they're creating a platform, like we're breaking down the table and making our own. And that to me can be the most powerful tool.
Definitely. I love that all of these projects are like born out of vexation, and for me personally, spite. So it's a very powerful motivator. So I completely agree. We do this so that we don't have to talk to anyone else or ask for permission. Thank you. Those are some really wonderful. Oh, sorry, go for it, Lisa.
Can I add a wee thing to that? Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. But I suppose also in the meantime is putting some pressure on the libraries of what they've got in stock. Just thinking about Cite Black Women as well. This whole thing around citation is something that we can. Even when I was doing my master's here, when I was speaking to my supervisor, he hadn't heard of a lot of the people that I was citing or trying to cite, or don't really know anything about critical race theory or whatever. There was one even seminar which I just ended up taking over because there was no distinction made between, let's say, prejudice or discrimination, let alone systemic discrimination or anything. I was like, right, I'm just going to take over this seminar, and he let me do it. But I think there should be that should be a standard thing where students can take, hold totally of a lesson, not just a presentation, but actually just teach one particular seminar, add to the reading list, and make sure that students can have a chance to change and expand that reading list, maybe even before they even reach the university, things like that, to put that in place. Dave wants to say something.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, but I'll throw this question out there for all the panelists mainly. To what extent do you believe that when we mention, or when you mention conversations around decolonizing the subject, the academy, to what extent are these taken as personal attacks? Because I know that a lot of persons might, academics might believe that this personal attack of you, Dave, that your curricula is colonized, and so that presents a sort of a defensive posture. So in your experiences, all of you, right, do you think that these invitations are perceived as attacks? And do you think that's a barrier to change?
Well, Project Myopia is about 4 years old now. We just had our 4-year anniversary in, I want to say, March. And at the beginning, it was taken very personally as an attack. Not so much now. I think part of the joy of being part of such a broad-reaching movement is that you can eventually get people to realize that, like, actually this is a systemic thing we're doing, and if you are getting upset about that, then you're part of the problem. Like, I'm sorry, but Shakespeare's not your mate. Like, he's not, it's okay. Like, it's really fine. So I think getting past that point where people are defensive, I think we're actually getting to, this is my little positive thing. I would say that we haven't had like anything but positivity in a good few years now for this project, and that's incredible to me. I'm actually genuinely, in fact, I said this to the team yesterday, I'm actually concerned about how much good press we get, because I'm worried that means we're doing something wrong. So but like, that's the kind of, I expected a lot more trolling or something, but this is I think the time is now to have these kinds of conversations, and we're just in conversation with so many wonderful organizations that it would be impossible and ridiculous to ignore at this point. It's the one thing that I can say as a positive for the neoliberalization of the academy. It does mean that when students have a lot to say about issues like this, that they no longer can ignore it. More of us could feel at home in.
Rihanna, when you say that, I just want to throw another one in the pot, the mixing pot. So in terms of phenomenology, right?
I don't know what that means. I'm going to just be honest.
So like in my
taking a stand.
Yeah, but in my culture, right? So we believe in, storytelling as authentic, right? Some things that just aren't written anywhere. It's passed down generations in stories, and critical race theory tells us about the power of storytelling and all of those ethnographic research and all of that sort of stuff, right? But I wonder the extent to which this is sort of articulated to students, particularly at an undergraduate level, authenticate that use. Because, of course we know we have to foreground or work in theories and, research and all that sort of stuff. But in terms of liberating curricula and decolonizing curricula broadly, there is an opportunity here, right, to engage with that type of knowledge and recognize it as authentic. Yes. Because culturally we know that is authentic knowledge, but who is the one that's keeping the tally, right? Who is the gatekeeper? To what extent they understand those understandings, or as
it's not about even taking away certain types of knowledge, it's about adding.
Exactly.
Like, you can use pedagogy and use the word pedagogy and praxis and all that alongside your own lived experience, and that can be just as valid.
Exactly. So we know, that Chinua Achebe spoke about it. What we don't want to do is to, condemn the westernized epistemology to the dustbin of knowledge. No, we want to introduce, epistemologies from the South to stand in parallel with those epistemologies as equal partners, and that is the direction of travel. We're not condemning anyone, as bad as it may be, or as much as it might have been an epistemology of its time. We need to acknowledge that there are myriad ways to present knowledge. So, I'm all for non-traditional ways, right? Because that is how we learn and grow and create this ecosystem where we can all coexist. That's what humanity is about.
It will allow us a more varied, a richer academy. It will allow us better research outputs, I think.
That's why the arts are so important, because the arts, the arts really accommodate that type of approach. I believe.
So I'm gonna just aim one question to Hannah here. And remember, we've got a little bit of time for a few more questions. So if you do have any then please do pop them in the chat. So I want to ask something that I think Samira popped a little note in the chat about how to engage with custodians if they don't want to hear it, and reminding us that the turkeys will never vote for Christmas. So as someone who, has been exposed to 1001 university marketing agendas and buzzwords, as the consumer, the marketable product, the prosumer in the neoliberal university, how would you recommend that we make sure we aren't pandering to these agendas and the buzzwords, but also how can we engage with the university when they don't want to hear it?
Yeah,
huge.
I'm gonna answer the first one and come back to that. But yeah, I think Uncover Ed's approach has mostly been to set our own agenda and be as radical as we can be, or as radical as we feel that we are. Does that make sense? Sometimes I think we've been pushed too far, or because the label of decolonial kind of came from them, and then it was like after a while we were like, is that what we're doing? Does that really apply here? But the more we call the university a colonial institution, an imperial institution, the less they want to have to do with us. So it's partly about being honest, I think, about what we're doing. But yeah, the turkeys won't vote for Christmas. I feel like the other half of it is not pitching Christmas to the turkeys, and it's about I'm not going to keep going with this it's too much, but my point is if you go towards community engagement, you go towards being student-led, student-focused, or youth-led, wherever your classroom is, whoever your group is. If you go from the ground up and have a grassroots approach to curriculum and teaching, that's how to keep it centered in being radical and being decolonial even, or changing something. I think sometimes we have to accept it's not, or if you're asking the university to do something for you, I think you've kind of already lost in a lot of ways. I think that's where Uncover is at now, and I don't know if it would work. I don't know if it works for every movement and every organization, but because I think sometimes we do need to change curriculums and we need to diversify some things. But sometimes it's just about, I think it's about laying bare what things are. If things aren't decolonial, we can't call them decolonial. And the more honest we are about these structures, the less easy it is for university to lie and market it and get away with it. That's where I'm at right now.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that, Hannah. Does have now reached the end of our time. So I just want to say our thank yous before I let you go. So first of all, Project Myopia, we have got a donations page that Samira is going to pop in the chat for us. We have come to the end of our current funding period, but we are about to apply for more, and it's all going to be fine. I believe it. But I think it's important that we promote this page, because it's lovely to not be beholden to institutions, and this has to be something where we're also thinking about crowdsourcing. We crowdsource our content, and it's lovely to also crowdfund our content. So please do, if you happen to have anything to spare, or please share. We would love if you could support our work here. I'd really appreciate that. Thank you. So I'm also have a massive thank you to say to all of our speakers. Not everyone's here, but just thank you so much for being such a dreamy lineup. I feel incredibly blessed that everyone said yes to us, and that we were able to have such an all-star team. It's exactly what I wanted. A huge thank you to our funding body, the London Arts and Humanities Partnership, who have hosted this Zoom for us and also funded the whole event. We are greatly indebted to you. Thank you to my team, without which I would definitely have keeled over by now. So thank you to Chinenye, who's been looking after our live stream on YouTube and also our emails. Even though they lost their laptop broke and they have malaria twice in the last month, they have still been here and they have been on deck. So thank you so much, Chinenye. Thank you to Samira for co-hosting and managing this Zoom alongside me, and for keeping me calm when I drank all that coffee. My blood has been pulsing in my ears for hours, and I'm not a coffee drinker, so it's been very distressing. Thank you to Kaitaki and Hannah, who've been live tweeting for us, and for Hannah, who stepped in to be on the panel last minute. Thank you so much. I could not have done it without you. And Kaitaki, you've been a real one from day, one of our wonderful editors at Project Myopia as well. Thank you to the audience who have stuck with us on this 8-hour conference. You're the realist. Well done. I can see your commitment to the cause just by you being here. So thank you so much for coming along, and we hope to see you at any future events. You know, our inbox is open. And yeah, I think we're happy to keep this Zoom open for a little while. If anyone wants to unmute and take mics or open mics and have a chat. If not, I am aware this has been an incredibly long day, and you are welcome to go and get some dinner. But otherwise, we will be here and happy to chat. So thank you all so much for coming.